Welcome to PaCT Workshop. This is the Philosophy and Critical Thinking workshop that I do once a month, and today's topic is good questions. This is a free workshop on Zoom, and I'm going to do a little bit of talking about today's topic, and then if you guys want to chime in and participate, feel free to do so. We have messages in the chat in case you feel better at typing or if your connection's bad, but I'm going to push a concept and then we're going to talk about it. But before I get into my thing, kind of wanted to give everybody a chance to say hello, and if you are so inclined, kind of what your thought was when you saw the topic before I jump into it and shove a topic down your throat. So did anybody have any interesting thoughts, like, oh, what is that? Or, oh yeah, I've thought that myself, or things like that.
I guess I was interested in just getting other people's perspective on asking questions that are not only good, but also respectful. And I don't know, I think I do struggle with asking people questions unless I'm in just a one-on-one conversation with them. But I get nervous about asking questions in larger groups because my brain starts to do calculus, like how can I be respectful of everybody's opinions and ask something that is, I don't know, it's kind of a ridiculous thing that I want to achieve, but yeah.
Well, I mean, Elon Musk wants to live on Mars, and that's not stopping him.
That's crazy, yeah.
But ridiculous isn't always bad. Okay. This is Michelle. She was actually on one of the chats that I was talking about when I do those talk show things, and that was a good chat. Okay, Michelle has some interesting perspectives on that. Rocky, Blaine, did you guys have anything to bring to the table?
Initially, I was kind of wondering what direction you were gonna go with the topic, because it's kind of it's open-ended, obviously.
Definitely.
In terms of good questions, I personally, my background, I was kind of raised with the idea that you can't ask too many questions. And there was no real good, bad, just try to figure out what the answers are to whatever it is that you're trying to get to the core of, the root. And so that's kind of the way I've always kind of approached everything, whether it's kind of like just the way you're trying to figure out life, society, religion, everything in between. I kind of was always in an environment where I could question things, which now I really appreciate, because I feel like, especially compared to, I have a lot of friends now who maybe came from different backgrounds, and they're like, no, this is we did things this way, and that's just the way we did this. Or different people who are like, we did it totally differently, and this is why. Whereas, at least the way I kind of was raised growing up, you just kind of came to whatever conclusion you wanted, and the whole idea was just, well, do you have evidence to prove it? And then, in fact, my father, who you guys have, I know for sure, Jordan, you've met before, but some of the other people may have in the past, is constantly one of those people that will,
yes,
why, well, why that, why that. So
Rocky's dad. Yeah, he came to some of the community discussions, and you may have, I don't know if, Michelle, you've been to one of the community sessions that he was at, but he asked questions that make everybody go, oop. And they're not like bad questions or mean questions, but they're like, I can't believe you just asked that kind of questions.
Oh, that's awesome.
Oh yeah, it keeps you on your toes for sure.
What's an example of a kind of question like that would make everybody kind of balk?
Oh man.
He asked, so we were having to talk about identity.
Oh, okay.
We started talking about the cultural influences that kind of pressure us to make our identities. And as far as I can tell, Jay, who is Rocky's dad, is an African-American person. And he asked to the group, what is black? And he was like, because as far as I can tell, like, Hispanic is a culture, like Armenian is I'm from a place, but black, that's not a place and that's not a culture. That's a term that we call these one group of people, but it's not connected to anything in the same way that the way we describe other people is connected. Chinese is a country. Black is not a country. What is that? And that was a really interesting question. And like when we were talking about it, like it kind of came out as far as the group discussion was concerned, that black is kind of equivalent to the N word, just nicer. It's just an insult that you give to these people because it has nothing to do with, like, my skin is never actually black. And then, like, if you go look at the etymology of Negro and niggardly and stuff like that, it normally means like withered and deathly. And so those kind of, like, questions like that, we're just bringing stuff up where I don't think, not necessarily it's bad to talk about, but it kind of like forces people to confront their thoughts and their prejudices and stuff, and then talk about it.
I've actually had that specific conversation with people before, and yeah, it does make people uncomfortable.
Yeah, and he's just like, I got a question. This is a question. I was like, oh, okay.
Was he there with his wife?
Yeah.
Wait, was this at the talk or was this at the workshop? Because I know I couldn't make it to the workshop because I got food poisoning in New York.
He's been to the at the bookstore. Those are
Was he? I feel like your dad may have been the person who. This was a moment for me where I was like, whoa, but he pointed at me and he asked, is she black? Because was that him?
Yeah.
That probably was him.
Okay, yeah, no, I mean, I actually really appreciated that, because my dad he's half African, half European descent, and I've always, like, my mom is Chinese Filipino, and I had no control over how I look, but I often, I don't know. Yeah, I often, I've struggled with people responding to me very strangely when I tell them about my ancestry. And it's true, like, I wouldn't be able to identify with a color, but I do identify with being part African. I know, again, it's for society, I don't appear that way, but I do. So I thought that was really interesting when he pointed to me and he said that. I was like, wow, damn.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would definitely say that out of, like, for example, my parents, my dad's the more inquisitive one, and whereas my mom is probably the more kind of, there is a certain level of reality, there's certain things we know, stop asking questions. She's more on that side. We just certain things we know. I'm kind of in between where I have that inquisitive nature, but can also maybe accept. I think back to that last probably the group discussion that we had where we talked about, like, what is truth, like how do we figure out what exactly is true and not true. So that's a very interesting kind of topic in terms of questions. The first thing that I immediately, when you said good question, I kind of wondered, is there a good thing about questioning, or is there too far that you can take wanting to know? Essentially, like, for example, everyone talks about like, what's the meaning of life? There's all these like really big, grand questions that we try to ask, and it's like maybe I've come across several people who say that at a certain point, like, there's no point in knowing. It's kind of more about the journey. But almost like when they say it's not about the destination, it's more about the journey. Kind of like in that respect. I always wonder which side is right.
Okay, we're starting to ask some very interesting, grand. What is that? Existentialism, I think. Blaine, please spell police me.
Existential would be the adjective, or the adjective form.
Existentialism. Okay.
Well, there's an I. It's like exist.
Exist.
Yeah, existentialism. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. What about you, Blaine? In terms of the topic, what are your first thoughts?
Well, legitimately, I learned about the topic when, like, I asked Rachel what time it was, and she's like, it's 7. I'm like, oh, Kingsley's thing is tonight. And then I looked at my phone. I'm like, oh, that's the topic. All right, let's go. But I heard something that Michelle was saying something about like respecting other people's opinions. Mm-hmm. And that got me thinking, and in conjunction with what you said as part of the intro about how like you do a ton of research and stuff, like, and you have it here too. It's a good question if, like, you really want to know the answer and you tried to get the answer yourself first, which made me think, like, do you need to earn the right to have an opinion about something? Because it seems like a lot of people think that anyone can have an opinion and it's valid, just regardless of how much research you've put into it. And I'm inclined to think otherwise. So I don't know. That's just an idea that I thought, because I thought you of all people would have an interesting response to that.
Oh yeah, I do. Are all opinions equal? That is a no. I'm gonna learn how to spell one of these days, Blaine. But
Put slash valid too, because because equivalency and validity are different, and I'd like to address both of them.
okay. Well, I always like to, if it's possible, like if there's 40 people that show up, it's not too possible, but if it is possible, I like to get your guys' ideas first, because I feel like once I talk for 10, 20 minutes about something, it's going to change what you would have initially said. So I just by virtue of like you listening to different thoughts. And so thank you guys for sharing. I do appreciate that. And I think we're going to circle back around to that. But for now, I'm going to kind of go into what is my take on a good question. And I had this gymnastics teacher in college who would just ask me questions. I guess she thought I was like an inquisitive young man or something like that. And she also ended up being the swimming teacher. And then I got a job lifeguarding at school when they opened up a new pool. And so I was like lifeguarding, and she was like my boss. And I'd known her for years because I took a gymnastics class like all the time. And this one day she was like, Jordan, I have a question for you. And I was like, all right. And she was like, is there some such thing as a bad question? And in my mind, I was like, yes. Like, and I didn't even have like a formulation for it, but I was like, yes, because I've been asked bad questions. And she was like, well, what is a bad question? I was like, I'll have to get back to you on that, but I know those are real. So we got to talking for a few weeks on this, and you get a lot of time to think when you're a lifeguard, because you got to sit on the tower and watch the water move and all that kind of stuff. And so this kind of started there, and I've had this in my mind for, I don't know, the last 5-6 years. But basically, I think kind of really starting at what Blaine was saying with like, are all opinions equal and valid? I think you could replace the word opinion with a lot of things, and one of the things you can replace it with is questions. And I think if you ask a question, that should be like a pure pursuit of actual knowledge. If you're asking a question, you should want to get the answer, not an answer you want, not confirmation or validation. You should be looking for information. And if you're truly looking for information, I don't think you would have asked a question until you tried to find it yourself, or you tried to ask yourself. So I really think in order to ask a good question, I wrote on a board. I don't know if you guys can see the board. I hope you guys can. I wrote down 4 things, and I think these work together. It's not you have to do 1 or 2. It's like you have to do all of them at the same time, and they break down to a lot of different things, which we'll talk about. And if you don't do all of these things, I don't think what you're doing is asking a good question. What I think you're doing is wasting people's time, and possibly something negative. But first, when I talk about asking good questions, I mean like to somebody else. So I would ask Rocky a question. And if I'm ever going to ask a question to somebody else, I need to have tried to ask myself first. If I don't try to ask myself the question first, then it kind of goes with this thing where I'm not doing any work. Good morning. I'm not doing any work to try and figure it out myself. I'm putting the burden of figuring it out on someone else. And sometimes that's really attractive when you think the other person is an expert in the thing. But just because somebody has more experience, or someone may have an answer that you desire, doesn't mean that before you ask, you should at least do some thought checking or some minor Googling or something yourself. Jog your brain before you try to jog someone else's brain. I think that's very important. Number 2, in asking a good question, Janine, we're kind of just going over the basic tenets. We kind of just started, so you're like right on time. Number 2, don't ask questions you don't want the answer to. If you ask a question like, does this dress make me look fat? I think that's an awful question. Not because like there's no answer to it, but I think you're asking that question usually, not all the time, but usually for an answer that's not true or an answer that's not related to the question. And I understand sometimes you ask certain questions so you can get other answers and you're being clever with your rhetoric, like you're trying to check people's emotional stability, so you ask questions this way and that way. I get that, but in terms of like theoretical good questions, like hardcore textbook open, what is a good question? I would say try to answer the question yourself first, and then really, if you're going to ask someone else, try and actually desire the answer. Sometimes people, I think, ask questions, and then it's apparent that they're not paying attention to the answer if it's too lengthy or something like that. So really want to know the answer, really listen to the answer. Third, if you're going to get an answer and you want to know the answer, actually consider the answer you got. You asked for a reason. Actually listen to the response. Don't just write it off because it's not something you want to hear, or that it tells you that you're not perfect or that you need to make some changes. Not necessarily every answer you get is correct, but or the best answer or useful, but hear it out. You asked the question. You asked somebody to do work for you. Hey, think about this and give me an answer. And you do work for them. I'm going to listen and really consider your answer. And then lastly, and this kind of ties back into what I said about number 2, ask for what you mean. If you're going to ask a good question, don't ask a question that is not pointed at getting the answer you want. And sometimes we do this on accident. Like I work at a technical job. I do some like engineering stuff. And sometimes I ask the wrong question because there's like technical details and I get one wrong, or I juxtapose the words incorrectly. And then someone gives me an answer that's like way off base. And then I'm like, oh, I asked the wrong question. Can I get this question instead? And they're like, oh yeah, that. But if you ask, how tall are you? And then what you really wanted to know is how fast you can run, then it's not a good question because you're not asking for what you're trying to get the answer to. So I think these are very basic, but you can really chop them up, and if you put them in practice with some certain situations, then I think it's kind of like a kit to help you understand when you are being useful and actually trying to seek knowledge, or wasting someone's time, or vice versa when somebody else is trying to be useful and seek knowledge or just trying to waste your time. I feel like if any of you guys have ever worked in an office, there is this like deluge, this flood of people asking you questions that they did not try to answer first, or asking questions that are not properly formulated. They come to you to try and figure out what the question is, but when somebody asks you the question, that means they've thought about it. When they ask you the real question, that means they've thought about it, they've prepared their topic enough to present to you in a way that it's coherent, and that means like they did work and they're really interested in it. And I think it's kind of one of the prerequisites in my mind to answering questions. But that's kind of the basic concept. And so to Rocky's tent in the first, when we were talking about what do you guys think, yeah, I do think there's bad questions, and it's the ones that fail this criteria, because I think questions are about seeking knowledge. They're about critical thinking, and it's about getting better, getting something that you didn't have before. And I think there's a lot of times, especially for that thing I was saying in the beginning, where sometimes people tend to desire answers that already go with their beliefs, or they tend to desire truths that are simple rather than truths that are realistic, because a lot of times realistic truths can be quite complicated. And so sometimes when things get too complicated, people back off and they're like, oh, wait. I just wanted you to say yes. I didn't want you to say it depends and then give me like all this criteria about this or that and make me think and evaluate. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I was headed with this. And you guys kind of brought up some different directions with it. But I think it's discussion time in case you guys are inclined. What do you guys think? Can you guys talk? Did I mute all of you? You guys can talk.
So you brought up that fat dress question, which I think as male people, anyone who's male has grappled with some permutation of that question.
Yeah.
And you mentioned it's one of those questions where like, are you really seeking an honest answer? And that's just a random example. There's a pretty basic one, but there's a lot of questions that people ask, and for whatever reason, they're not necessarily likely to receive 100% honest answer. Like if I was asking my friends, hey guys, do you think I'm cool? Like I'm probably fishing for something or trying to like rebuild my self-confidence or
Oh
something.
yeah, ask an answerable question. That's a good one.
So, so I was thinking, and just a thought is like, how do you and I have, I guess, my own thoughts on this, but do you have any ideas on like how you get honesty from intrinsically biased questions? Like if you're like, let's say, because that the fat dress question is like you said, it can be fishing for a compliment or something, but it could also be a legitimate concern. And if you're asking, you really want to know the answer, but you know that if you're asking it from your husband's perspective or whatever, you know he's probably going to soften it or something. Is there any way to like take a question like that and turn it into something that is more likely to get an honest response?
I think so. I think kind of along with the lines of asking for what you mean. If you ask in ultimatums, where I mean, you can answer the question differently. Do I look fat in this dress? But what you're asking is a yes or no question. That's like a positive extreme or a negative extreme question. Like you're setting someone up, like with a leading question. And a leading question, I I always fail to get examples of these, but like if you're already pushing for an answer, then I don't think that you're asking a good question. Like giving people within the frame of the question as much freedom as possible to answer what they think without judgment, I think has a lot to do with the rhetoric you use when you're asking the question.
And a leading question would be something like, you murdered him, didn't you?
Yes. And
Right.
now like you're already imposing an answer on me. And there's a lot of ways to do that in a much, much, much more subtle way. And if really you want to know how you look in that dress, I would say the question to ask is, how do I look?
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, maybe you specifically want to know if you look fat in this dress or whatever, but I think a lot of times we don't ask the question that actually gets what we want. And sometimes we do that because, like, as humans, we're not perfect and we think we're asking a good question. But sometimes we just blatantly ask the wrong question, or we ask it in a very emotional way that makes it not easy to answer. Like when you're saying with leading questions, I think leading questions are often emotional questions. Like you ask um, questions that already have answers tied in them because somebody is like trying to ping you towards that. Um, but oh yeah, that's kind of what I think on that.
I also kind of thought it was interesting when you said that the purpose of asking your question is inherently to gain information. And I was like, my first instinct was, that's not true. There's probably several reasons why you could ask a question. But every reason I thought of boiled down to trying to get information. I'm like, that makes sense, actually. I mean, like the context, of course, matters, but I think you're right on the nose about that.
It could be different types of information. It could be
Yeah.
like emotional information or behavioral information or factual information. But you're like, the whole idea of a question, at least in my mind, is I don't know. Can you help me know?
I think you could also ask questions that you do know, or you at least think you know. Like, for example, that murder question would be something like a lawyer might ask, and they think they know that the person's guilty and they want them to say that, but they are looking for information as they do it.
Okay. Well, that I think I would still consider a bad question because it starts dipping into manipulation.
But for their purposes, is it a good question?
That's not chapter 1 in the questions textbook. That's more like chapter 17.
My bad.
But yeah, and then also I was thinking that you brought that up. Like sometimes you ask a question that you know the answer to, because you are trying to get the other person to get to an answer. So by getting them to think about it, you get them to internalize it. So like therapists do this all the time, where they ask you questions and they're not really interested in the answer. They're interested in you coming to a conclusion by jogging yourself with them asking. So I still think that's kind of a good question. Did you try to answer? I'm gonna try to force that into my philosophy right now. But did anybody have anything else to add or anything to say while I'm trying to make myself coherent with all my thoughts?
Well, I was thinking with that question, if someone were to ask, how do I look in this outfit? I almost feel like maybe in that moment it is about how do they look in the outfit, but I also wonder if there's like questions within the questions, like, do you love me? And do you think I'm attractive? And these are all things that they're maybe too afraid to ask. And so instead they ask these like little roundabout questions. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think maybe Blaine said this kind of preemptively earlier, and not to do that to like push the blame on Blaine, but I think maybe there is an implicit desire for straightforward questions that tends to come from people that are male. And yeah, I totally get that there's often like read between the lines kind of ways of talking where you're asking certain questions, but to me, when you're doing that kind of thing, Michelle, it makes me feel like you're not asking me a question, you're testing me.
Yeah.
Which is a tests are a series of questions. I get that. So Blaine, before you stop police on me, but they're like you're being graded and evaluated based on your answer, and I don't think that's right. I think when you ask someone a question,
Yeah.
you just listen to their answer and consider it, and if you don't like it or if you don't believe in it, you're like, okay, that's cool, but you're not judging them based on the answer they gave you. You're judging the information they gave you.
Right. Well, I guess I wasn't saying it's good to ask those questions. I would feel, I don't know, I personally haven't, I don't think, just because I kind of knew that it doesn't really matter what my partner thinks. They better like whatever I look like. But I'm just saying, well, I'm just saying though that I feel like there's something, I mean, it's something maybe within that person that I'm sorry, there's something within that person that they need to figure out another way to communicate with their partner, and there's something else there. And even though it's not a great question, I don't know what I'm trying to get at. I think that's it. I'm still trying to get at it. So yeah.
Oh, good. I think one of the main reasons that I have these workshops is so that we can discuss ideas and push them out of each other. And like by asking questions, Blaine will say something, and then Rocky will be like, oh, that makes me think of this, and we build our concepts. I think by being open and asking good questions and really listening to the answers without putting our own opinions or our own slights on what other people are saying, we get further way faster. And so yeah, if you have a half-built concept, just say it out loud and maybe we can help you build it. But that's very interesting, the questions within questions thing. I think if you're asked to that, almost every time I would feel there's some form of I don't really want the answer. I only want a certain set of possible answers, but I don't want these answers. So I'm going to ask it in a confusing way so that if I get one of these answers, I can use some mental gymnastics to put myself over here.
Yeah.
I'd also like to point out that when you said the goal of all questions are to get information, one of the rebuttals I came up with was, no, you could be trying to get someone else's opinion on something, but then I realized their opinion is inherently information. So you may ask questions and the answer to the question isn't what you're looking for. Like, I don't know, like on certain tests, like psychology tests, they might ask you something where you think the answer is straightforward, but in reality, they're trying to just see how you would answer that, which kind of gives them information about what kind of person you are. Like if I say, like, how many guns do you own? Like, I may not care how many guns you own, but the fact you said 50 answers my real question of, like, are you a paranoid, like, doomsday prepper or something like that? And that was off the cuff example, so it wasn't very good. But you're asking a question to get an answer, because it's like, if you've ever, like, done one of those psychology things where they pay you like $10 or whatever to answer some questions or sit in a room and do stuff, it's like, if you know the point of the question, it defeats the purpose of the question. So you ask something different that kind of, again, you're seeking information. So I still agree with you there, but the information you're seeking isn't necessarily what you're asking, is all I'm trying to say.
Blaine, I don't know where you got the link to buy the questions textbook before the class, but yes.
My bad.
No, it's all good. It's just like you. I'm glad you came to this, and it's like, because I think with this, all of these guidelines that I'm trying to state or push out they work both ways, and so if I'm asking you a question to shield me from the truth, if I'm asking it in a way that's like questions under questions, so that I can help protect myself from the answer, you can do that in the opposite way, where maybe I know the other person is going to try and protect themselves, so I have to ask a question to get around their psychology of not giving me the real answer if I ask them the real question. And then you start getting into like multiplication of questions where like negatives cancel out negatives, and you're doing all this like arithmetic to try and like get to the straightforward answer. And that's like just engineering back into stuff where there's all this crazy blah 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 going on in the back, but in the front it looks okay. But I think the whole point of asking those types of questions is really to get the real answer. And if you could ask the straightforward question and be confident that you'd get the real answer, you just ask the straightforward question. That's what I think.
I don't know. It seems like it can be pretty complicated because, like, for like what Blaine was talking about, I can kind of recall situations like that. Like the first thing that when he mentioned his idea, what came to mind was this conversation that happened years ago between David Stern, the NBA commissioner, right before Silver, and Jim Rome. They were on like this call or whatever for, I think Jim Rome's either radio show or TV show, and Jim Rome was asking this guy if he rigged the NBA lottery, the draft lottery, which is kind of like, as a question, you're just kind of like, of all the things I'm going to ask you, why would a reporter ask a commissioner if he basically cheated his organization? And it's just like, and to deflect, David Stern then asked Jim Rome, "Would you still beat your wife?" And it's just like, and that was kind of like one of those weird curveballs that David Stern was known for doing, just with many reporters that he spoke to. But it was just kind of like a weird situation where obviously this guy doesn't really want the answer to like that question, because it's just something that he's using to kind of misdirect and kind of throw the conversation off in a totally different direction.
Okay. Thoughts? I'm curious if you guys think that an accusation is a form of a leading question.
I think depending on how you ask it, like if you ask it in a situation where someone can't plausibly give a yes or no question, like a question like that where you're implying that something has happened,
like, are you a murderer?
Well, with something like that, you can honestly say yes or no, and it doesn't necessarily imply the same thing. Versus if you say, "Do you still rob banks?" That automatically implies that at some point you did. So even if you say no, you may be saying no, I don't, as in no, I've never have and I never will. But by saying that, you're implying, well, you did in the past, now I don't anymore.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I wasn't saying anything. I thought Blaine was about to say something.
I was on mute.
Oh.
Okay.
Well, because I think like within each category, there's like different levels of things, and there are like very harsh leading questions. And then I think there's very subtle leading questions, and the subtle ones I think are the worst ones, because they're not as accusatory, But if I'm like, Rocky, did you murder this person? And I asked you out of us 5, like that is a leading question because I'm implicitly accusing you of murdering someone. Or like did you cheat on me? Like that, yes, it's a yes or no question, but it's an accusation at the same time, which I think that's why it leads into that. And part of that I think can be if I do that in public or out loud in front of people. Yes, I asked you a simple question, and no, I didn't technically accuse you of anything, but I brought that idea into the sphere of the group that that you could have been cheating on me, or that I am doubtful that you are faithful because I'm even asking the question. And then that can kind of the point of a question sometimes can not be to gain information, it can be to like elicit an effect.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. I feel like you, many times in like legal cases, sometimes like whether it's the defense or if it is the prosecuting side, they may ask a question of a witness, knowing that there's going to be some sort of objection to it, but just so that they can get the idea out into maybe the jury's mind or get it out so that it'll be in the official record, something like that, just so that they can get the idea out there.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys watched Law and Order, but that was a great show. I think this is a good discussion. I was kind of coming at it. I think I always come at it from like the nebulous, theoretical standpoint of like, if I were to ask a good question, what would it be? And then when I talk to other people, they're always like, well, what about reality? And I'm like, oh yeah, reality. So you guys are bringing up a lot of interesting points, and I appreciate that. So thank you guys. I think we talked a little bit about answerable questions, and I kind of wanted to bring it back around to the different things we said at the beginning. Sorry, Janine. Ooh. You I think you missed that a little bit, but Michelle was alluding to sometimes having some difficulty with asking questions because maybe the question will not be perceived as respectful, especially when you're asking a group of diverse people. Sometimes it's hard to please everybody, and I think that's very true. I think pleasing everybody is like a losing game, but it's one that we all really want to play for some reason. And in terms of respectful questions, I think a question is respectful when you kind of follow the guidelines that I put down. Because if I'm asking you a direct question that I want to know the answer to, that I tried to answer myself, and I value your opinion, it could be a tough question, but that's not a disrespectful question.
Yeah, I can see that. I guess it's just tricky because with people, I think sometimes depending on how tough the question is, they might deal with their own, they might feel embarrassed. They might feel like they don't respond. I mean, I guess that's something that I don't worry too much about. Because yeah, I agree. I think that as long as you actually care about the answer, and you mean if I'm asking someone something about themselves, there's no way I can answer that for myself. Then yeah. And if it's not leading and manipulative or, that kind of.
And then in terms of like asking questions for effect, I think sometimes like it does make sense to kind of note who your audience is when you're asking a question. So like if I'm gonna ask, like if I'm in a relationship with Blaine and I'm gonna ask him if he's cheating on me, maybe I shouldn't ask him at dinner with all our friends. Maybe I should ask him later in the car.
Why was I the example? I'm the worst person here to be the example for that.
What are you talking about? You're the best one because you're my family, so it's the least offensive to anybody.
That makes sense.
But sometimes I think like knowing your audience is part of being respectful, and so I think having an eye for maintaining respect when asking your questions. Like sometimes people get up on stage and they're talking, and then there's like a questionnaire in front of this big crowd, and these people just ask these like crazy blazing questions to people, but it's like in front of hundreds and hundreds of people, and sometimes that question would have done better in a letter. But
Oh yeah, definitely. And two, there are some questions that people always hesitate on how to ask at all. Like the common one that I'll see a lot is a guy who sees a woman who he thinks is pregnant, but he's not sure. And so he's like, how do I bring it up without knowing for sure? And then to the point where I've even known people who have just said, I'll just wait it out. I'll just wait it out until she's like showing, and then it'll be obvious. And it's just like that pause where they're like, I don't know how to ask if she's expecting so I can congratulate her. Whereas everyone's afraid, well, what if she's not? And you're like, okay, so yeah, that was weird.
I don't think those kind of questions are weird. I think like in terms of being awkward, and I've always thought it takes two to tango. And so if I ask Janine something super awkward, but Janine like deflects the awkward and just answers it normal, it's not awkward. She has to like accept the awkward, and we have to both sit in it for it to actually happen. And so like if you're like, oh, when are you expecting, and you're like, I'm not pregnant, and then you just move on, it's fine. I think it's bad when you like ask a question and then the answer you get embarrasses you, and then you try to like moonwalk out of it. Then it starts getting bad. Oh, I'm sorry. Like, don't do that. Just move on. You got the answer you wanted. Say thank you and move on.
Earlier, you said something about the difference between asking someone a personal question in like in private or like in front of a lot of people. And like you kind of portrayed that, and forgive me if I'm reading too much, you portrayed that as kind of like a negative thing. Like you shouldn't do that.
Well, more like understand your audience, and that was an example. But sometimes, like with an intervention or something, like the group is important.
That was where I was going with that. Yeah, because like the information you're trying to get from the question is not necessarily what the response is, but how the person will respond to it under this set of circumstances. Like you brought up the cheating example. Like if you want to know if your partner's cheating on you, like ask them in private. They might be cool and composed, and they might like just like say the spiel they planned when they knew you were going to ask that. But if you ask them in public with their friends and they stumble, that might say something, that might say more than what their actual answer says, like the demeanor in which they do it in a set of circumstances.
I feel like if somebody asked me if they were cheating in public, I would stutter just because I'd be like so appalled that somebody would ask me that.
Maybe, but like I'm not saying like it's a tactic that will work the same on everybody. But if you know someone's personality and like you think that their reaction is like knowing what you know about them, their reaction says a lot about their actual intents. It's kind of like the logic behind a polygraph test, where like you could react the same way as someone else, but the test could flag you as a liar and not them because there's certain subtleties or something that it catches that you don't. And if you know someone for a long time, there's probably certain subtleties that you'll catch that other people won't, that might be dragged out by the environment.
Huh. Actually, Blaine, I think you might have a different textbook.
We might have a different edition of the same textbook.
Yeah. Oh, maybe. Because like that to me is very straightforward manipulation. Where I don't want your answer. I want this situation to produce an answer. And
for the record, I agree that I 100% agree that it's manipulation. But I guess I was wondering if manipulation is a valid tactic when like you said, that the point of questions is to get answers. If the information you're trying to get is better served by manipulation, if you think there's an ethical problem with using it.
I think I might jump in. Wait, can I jump in?
Yeah, just go.
Okay, so at least what I'm absorbing right now is like I think the biggest intention that I would always pose to myself before I'd even have a question go out is this a question that could be answered binary, which means it's just a yes or no? And then what Jordan, I think you've been emphasizing a lot is what is your relationship or what is the audience? Because in my eyes, like if these are questions where I could get them answered yes or no, and it's with like a loved one, or like I'm in a relationship with them. Is it something that I want answered in one word? Then knowing like what Michelle and you had all posed earlier with examples is like, am I going to be satisfied with the relationship question where I say like, do I look good in this dress, with a yes or no? Knowing that the inflection in their voice, I could make thousands of meanings out of the yes or no, knowing that those are the only two answers I gave them, versus what Jordan had said, like, how do I look? Versus if I'm like in an office meeting and I open up after I give like a presentation on why we should have road closures. Are people going to be giving me posed questions where they're yes or no? And then do I answer with the because? Because for a lot of the questions that are being asked, like, what was the one example? Like, did you cheat on me or something? We all know that would be like a yes or no question, or you might even be like a little flabbergasted. Whereas in my mind, I'm like, well, if you ask a politician, they're not going to give you yes or no. Is the house blue? That's a great question. I've been thinking about that for the last 12 years. So with a lot of these conversations going back and forth, I guess the first thing I would bring up is it a binary question that could be answered yes or no? And then I think to the point that you were about to bring up, Blaine, and I'm not quite sure about that. Is it that you want it to be a yes or no easy? And then is there going to be meaning derived behind how the person who's answering is going to inflect on said answer?
The second thing, like if there's meaning behind in things that they don't say, like nonverbal cues and such.
Yeah, to that, I was listening to this podcast, the Fundamentalist podcast. Is like one of my favorite podcasts, and this philosopher guy was putting forward this concept. His name's Peter Rollins. That every form of communication involves some truth. It's impossible to 100% lie, and like if like I really was cheating on Blaine and he asked me and I said no, something about the way I communicated the no would say yes. And it could be my eyes, it could be my voice, my intonation and stuff like that. And so maybe I think pressuring somebody to answer in certain situations, I think it is a form of manipulation, and I try very hard not to do that. I'm like very anti-manipulation. If I think it is even kind of manipulation, I'm like, gotta wait for a better time. This is wrong. But sometimes I think people can feel that they can set someone up to where the truth comes out more naturally. Or like, let's say we were all at dinner and maybe like I was cheating with Janine, but I'm like with Blaine and we're all at dinner, and then Blaine accuses me really loud, like, are you cheating? But then he looks at Janine because he suspects Janine to be the person. And so there could be different ways to get information. And what I was trying to pose with this topic was like, theoretically, if you're going to be a good ethical person and you want information, how should you go about doing it? And then there's plenty of other chapters in the book about if you maybe don't care so much about ethics, how can you go about getting information? Or if other people don't care about ethics, how might they go about trying to get you to give them information? But this was
right. We did have two different textbooks there because that was the one I was reading.
Okay. But this was very just basic, like if there was a possible way to say, like, is there some such thing as like the good question, like Aristotle is like, is there some such thing as good? That kind of question, as far as answering that in terms of what would that question be? Talk about meta, but I think if an honest, good, straightforward question does have criteria, and every question someone asks in an honest way is not always a good question. It's not always an evil question. I would say it's more of there are better ways to ask questions and better ways to get information if you're truly seeking honest answers.
Hey, Kingsley, I can hear Al is getting ornery. I probably got to go put her to bed.
Okay, well, it's pretty much 8 o'clock, so this is designed to be an hour, and I'm glad you guys showed up. I hope you guys got something out of it. I always love to chat with different people and to share ideas. So if you guys want to continue the conversation offline, please do. But this is a monthly thing. I have a weekly podcast that comes out every Friday. Janine, I had one come out last week on logic aliasing. I think you'd like that one a lot. And
Wait, what's the podcast called?
it's called Perspectal, and it's basically on everything. It just got on Apple Podcasts. It's on Spotify. It's on like every platform I've ever heard for podcasts.
And then what's the other one that you listen to?
That's a podcast, man.
No.
Oh.
You that's the one you made. What's the one you listen to? What is the philosophy on it?
It's called The Fundamentalists. And if you guys forget anything I say, just like DM me and I'll send you the links to stuff.
Thank you.
But you got the workshop every month, got a community discussion coming up on friendship. So what is friendship? And what do we do when we're making rules for who's our friend, who's not our friend? And how can that help us or hurt us? And I want to get other people's opinions on if they have like criteria for friends and stuff like that. But other than that, we got the podcast, the workshop, the community discussion, and then we do something called reality chat every week. And we just get two people in a room or on the internet and have a deep kind of conversation like this, but it's more like only two people talking and everybody else is watching. But yeah, thank you guys for coming. And if you want to get any of those links or whatever, just let me know and I'll send it to you.
All right.
I'll reach out to
Thank you, bro. That was a pretty good one.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Catch you guys later.
Nice.
Side note though, Rocky, have you ever watched what is that called? Family Guy.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
There is that the second